Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Robert from El Magnifico Games, and today we are going to continue with our normal Wednesday poetry, prose, and riddles stream. So, starting with the poetry. Last week we finished on a poem entitled I Remember by Thomas Hood. Thomas Hood was this individual. An English poet, never robust, had lapsed into invalidism by the age of 41 and died at the age of 45. Quite successful in his time, wrote regularly for the London Magazine, Athenaeum and Punch, wrote several notable poems. Again, we talked about all this in much more detail last week, which is why I'm not going into great detail this time. But that's who he was. And as usual, we'll begin the stream by rereading the last poem we finished on, and then we'll move on to something new. So, I remember the house where I was born, the little window where the sun came peeping in at morn. He never came a wink too soon, nor brought too long a day, but now I often wish the night had borne my breath away. I remember the roses red and white, the violets in the lily cups, as flowers made of light, the lilacs where the robin built, and where my brother sat, the laburnum on his birthday, the tree is living yet. I remember where I was used to swing, and thought the air must rush as fresh to swallows on the wing. My spirit flew in feathers then, that is so heavy now, and summer pools could hardly cool the fever on my brow. I remember the fir trees dark and high. I used to think their slender tops were close against the sky. It was a childish ignorance, but now 'tis little joy to know I'm farther off from heaven than when I was a boy. So quite an interesting and arguably powerful poem, but we discussed it last week. So, moving on, we next have a poem entitled To Celia, by Ben Jonson. Benjamin Jonson was an English playwright and poet. Jonson's artistry exerted a lasting influence upon English poetry and stage comedy. He popularized the comedy of humours. He is best known for his for the satirical plays Every Man in His Humour, Volpone or the Fox, The Alchemist, and Bartholomew Fair, and for his lyric and epigrammic poetry, He is generally regarded as the second most important English dramatist after William Shakespeare during the reign of James I. The comedy of humour is a genre of dramatic comedy that focuses on a character or range of characters, each of whom exhibits two or more overriding traits or humours that dominates their personality, desires and conduct. Johnson was classically educated, well-read and cultured man of the English Renaissance, with an appetite for controversy, personal and political, artistic and intellectual. His cultural influence was unparalleled breadth upon the playwrights and the poets of the Jacobean era and of the Caroline era. Interesting. His ancestors spelled the family name with a... well, that's not important. I wouldn't have thought. That's probably... I'd have thought that's enough background for us to try and to add context to the reading of his poetry. So, to Celia. Drink to me only with thine eyes, and I will pledge with mine. I'll leave a kiss but in the cup, and I'll not look for wine. The first that from the soul doth rise, doth ask a drink divine. But might I of Jove's nectar sup, I would not change for thine. I sent thee late a rosy wreath, not so much honouring thee, as giving it a hope that there it could not wither be. But thou thereon didst only breathe, and sentest it back to me, since when it grows and smells, I swear, not of itself but thee. Interesting. So I think this is a poem about unrequited love. Certainly it's certainly within the genre of romance. So it looks like every even-numbered line rhymes within each stanza. So we have mine, wine, divine and thine, and we have thee, be, me and thee again. Now, is there a meter? It's got a syllabic structure. Every odd line seems to have 8 syllables, every even 6. Given that it's even, we can rule out any trisyllabic meter. Don't think there is a meter. Yeah, because I don't think either an iambic structure or its analog a trochee works. The first verse is a good example of this. It's not going to be iambic. Because it won't be drink to me only with thine. But equally, I don't think a trochee particularly works. Drink to me only with thine eyes. Neither particularly works. So I think we can rule out a meter. Of course, I'm no expert, I could be wrong, but I don't think there's a meter there. But we do have a certain rhythmic structure in that we have this 8-syllable, 6-syllable repeating structure, and we also have a rhyming structure, a ABCB type structure. So as far as the craft of the poem is concerned, that concludes about everything. Are there any words that anyone would like looked up or discussed? Or in fact anything else about this poem that anyone would like discussed? It's interesting that the poet refers to, but might I of Jove's nectar sup, I would not change for thine. Since the poet is quite blatantly saying, I hold my love for you above God. Which, it's interesting that they felt confident expressing such sentiments back then. But yeah, I think the meaning of this poem is relatively straightforward. So I'll move on to the final reading. Again, if anyone wants to discuss anything, just put it into chat and I'll look at it when I've finished reading this poem for the final time. Drink to me only with thine eyes, and I'll pledge with mine, or leave a kiss but in the cup, and I'll not look for wine. The first that from the soul doth rise, doth ask a drink divine, but might I of Jove's nectar sup, I would not change for thine. I sent thee late a rosy wreath, not so much honouring thee, as giving it a hope that there it could not wither be. But thou thereon didst only breathe, and senteth it back to me, since when it grows and smells, I swear, not of itself but thee. So, moving on. John Keats. This appears to be much later. This would be Georgian England. John Keats, 1795 to 1821, was an English poet of the second generation of Romantic poets, with Lord Byron and Percy Shelley. Although his poems had been in publication for less than 4 years when he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25, that's quite sad, they were indifferently received in his lifetime, but his fame grew rapidly after his death. By the end of the century, he was placed in the canon of English literature, strongly influencing many writers of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The Encyclopaedia Britannica of 1888 called one ode one of the final masterpieces. Jorg Louis Borges, I'm not sure how that should be pronounced, I'm afraid, named his first encounter with Keats as an experience he felt all his life. Keats had a style heavily loaded with sensualities, notably in the series of odes. Typically of the Romantics, he accentuated extreme emotion through natural imagery. Today's poems and letters remain among the most popular and analysed in English literature, in particular Ode to a Nightingale Ode on a Grecian Urn, Sleep and Poetry, and the sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer. So, John Keats was born in Moorgate, London on the 31st of October 1795 to Thomas and Frances Keats. There is little evidence of his exact birthplace, although Keats and his family seem to have marked his birthday on the 29th of October. Then I wonder why they claim he was born on the 31st. Baptism records give the date as the 31st. Oh, I see. He was the eldest of 4 surviving children. His younger siblings were George, Thomas, and Frances Mary, Fanny, who later married the Spanish author Valentin Llanos Gutierrez. I apologise, I will be butchering that pronunciation. Another son was lost in infancy. His father first worked as a hostler, a groom or stableman, who was employed in the stable to take care of horses, usually an inn. At the stables attached to the Swan and Hoop Inn, owned by his father-in-law, John Jennings, an establishment he later managed and where the growing family lived for some years. Keats believed he was born at the inn, a birthplace of humble origins, but there is no evidence to support this. The Globe pub now occupies the site. A few yards from modern Moorgate Station, Keats was baptised at St. Botoloff without Bishopsgate and sent to a local dame school as a child. Dame schools were small privately run schools for young children that emerged in the British Isles and its colonies during the early modern period. These schools were taught by a school dame, a local woman who would educate children for a small fee. His parents wished to send their sons to Eton or Harrow, but the family decided they could not afford the fees. In the summer of 1803, John was sent to a board at John Clark's School in Enfield, close to his grandparents' house. The small school had a liberal outlook and a progressive curriculum more modern than the larger, more prestigious schools. In the family atmosphere at Clark's, Keats developed an interest in classics and history, which would stay with him throughout his short life. The headmaster's son, Charles Cowden Clark, also became an important mentor and friend, introducing Keats to Renaissance literature, including Tasso, Spenser, and Chapman's translations. So, yes, the first poem we'll be looking at from John Keats is on first looking into Chapman's Homer. So that will be Chapman's translation of the Greek writer Homer, who wrote several important works such as the Odyssey and what was it called? The Iliad. The young Keats was described by his friend Edward Holmes as a volatile character, always in extremes, given to indolence and fighting. However, at 13 he began focusing his energy on reading and study, winning his first academic prize in Midsummer 1809. In April 1804, when Keats was 8, his father died from a skull fracture after falling from his horse while returning from a visit to Keats and his brother George at school. Thomas Keats died intestate. Frances remarried 2 months later, but left her new husband soon afterwards, and the 4 children went to live with a grandmother, Alice Jennings, in the village of Edmonton. In March 1810, when Keats was 14, his mother died of tuberculosis, leaving the children in their grandmother's custody. She appointed 2 guardians, Richard Abbey and John Sandal, for them. That autumn, Keats left Clark's School to be an apprentice with Thomas Hammond, a surgeon and apothecary, who was a neighbour and the doctor of the Jennings family. Keats lodged in the attic above the surgery at 7 Church Street until 1813. Cowden Clark, who remained close to Keats, called this period the most placid time in Keats' life. Does placid mean boring and uninteresting? I think it does. Calm and quiet, peaceful, tranquil. Yes. Not necessarily boring, but that's probably what they're getting at. Early career. From 1814, Keats had two bequests, held in trust for him until his 21st birthday. £800 was willed by his grandfather, John Jennings. Also, Keats' mother left a legacy of £8,000 to be equally divided among her living children. It seems he was not told of the £800 and probably knew nothing of it, as he never applied for it. Historically, blame has often been laid on Abbey as legal guardian, but he may also have been unaware of it. William Walton, solicitors for Keats' mother and grandmother, definitely knew and had a duty of care to relay the information to Keats. It seems he did not, though it would have made a critical difference to the poet's expectations. Money was always a great concern, and difficulty struggled to stay out of debt and make his way in the world independently. Having finished his apprenticeship with Hammond, Keats registered as a medical student at Guy's Hospital, now part of King's College, London, and began studying there in October 1815. Within a month, he was accepted as a dresser of the hospital, assisting surgeons during operations, the equivalent of a junior house surgeon today. It was a significant promotion that marked a distinct aptitude for medicine and brought greater responsibility and a heavier workload. Keats' long and expensive medical training with Hammond and at Guy's Hospital led his family to assume he would pursue a lifelong career in medicine, assuring financial security, and it seems that, at this point, Keats had a genuine desire to become a doctor. He lodged near the hospital at 28 St. Thomas's Street in Southwark, with other medical students, including Henry Stevens, who gained fame as an inventor and ink magnate. Keats' training took up increasing amounts of his writing time. He became increasingly ambivalent about it. He felt he was facing a stark choice. Ambivalent. Doesn't that mean... I thought that meant sort of disinterested. Simultaneous experience of expressing opposing or contradictory feelings, beliefs or motivations, alternately having one opinion or feeling and then the opposite. Okay, so ambivalent means something rather different to what I thought. He felt he was facing a stark choice. He had written his first extant poem, An Imitation of Spenser, in 1814 when he was 19. Now strongly drawn by ambition, inspired by fellow poets such as Leigh Hunt and Lord Byron, and believed by family financial crisis, he suffered periods of depression. His brother George wrote that John feared that he should never be a poet, and if he was not, he would destroy himself. In 1816, Keats received his apothecary license, which made him eligible to practice as an apothecary, physician and surgeon, but before the end of the year he had informed his guardian that he resolved to be a poet, not a surgeon. Although he continued his work and training at Guy's, Keats devoted more and more time to the study of literature, experimenting with verse forms, particularly the sonnet. In May 1816, Leigh Hunt agreed to publish the sonnet O Solitude in the magazine The Examiner, a leading liberal magazine of the day. This was the first appearance of Keats' poetry in print. Charles Cowden Clarke called it his friend's red letter day. First proof that Keats' ambitions were valid. Among his poems of 1816 was To My Brothers. That summer Keats went with Clarke to the seaside town of Margate to write. They began Calidore and initialised an era of great letter writing. On returning to London, he took lodgings at 8 Dean Street, Southwark. I might be mispronouncing that, I'm not sure. Embraced himself to study further for the membership of the Royal College of Surgeons. In October 18... Well, I don't like to read the entire Wikipedia articles, only relevant bits. It does seem like he... There's quite a lot of detail to his life that is known, though. I guess I'll read up to the end of this section. In October 1816, Clarke introduced Keats to the influential Leigh Hunt, a close friend of Byron and Shelley. 5 months later came the publication of Poems, the first volume of Keats' verse, which included I Stood Tiptoe and Sleep and Poetry, both strongly influenced by Hunt. The book was a critical failure, arousing little interest, although Reynolds reviewed it favourably in The Champion. Clarke commented that the book might have emerged in Timbuktu. Keats' publishers, Charles and James Ollier, felt ashamed of it. Keats immediately changed publishers to Taylor and Hesse in Fleet Street. Unlike the Olliers, Keats' new publishers were enthusiastic about his work. Within a month of the publication of Poems, they were planning a new Keats volume and had paid him in advance. Hesse became a steady friend of Keats and made the company's rooms available for young writers to meet. Their publishing list came to include Coleridge, Hazlitt, Clare, Hogg, Carlyle, and Charles Lamb. Through Taylor and Hesse, Keats met their Eton-educated lawyer Richard Woodhouse, who advised him on literary as well as legal matters and was deeply impressed by Poems, although he noted that Keats could be wayward, trembling, easily daunted. Woodhouse was convinced of Keats' genius, a poet to support as he became one of England's greatest writers. Soon after they met, the two became close friends, and Woodhouse started to collect Keatsiana, documenting as much as he could about the poetry. The archive survives as one of the main sources of information on Keats' work. Andrew Motion represents him as Boswell to Keats' Johnson, ceaselessly promoting his work, fighting his corner, and spurring his poetry to greater heights. In later years, Woodhouse was one of the few to accompany Keats to Gravesend, Kent, to embark on his final trip to Rome. Despite the bad reviews of Poems, Hunt published the essay Three Young Poets, Shelley, Keats and Reynolds, and the sonnet On First Looking into Chapman's Homer, foreseeing great things to come. He introduced Keats to many prominent men in his circle, including the editor of the Times, Thomas Barnes, the writer Lamb, the conductor Vincent Novello, and the poet John Hamilton Reynolds, who had become a close friend. Keats also met regularly with William Hazlitt, a powerful literary figure of the day. It was a turning point for Keats, establishing him in the public eye as a figure in what Hunt termed a new school of poetry. At this time, Keats wrote to his friend Bailey, I'm certain of nothing but the holiness of the heart's affections, and the truth of the imagination. What imagination ceases as beauty must be truth. This passage would eventually be transmuted into the concluding lines of an ode on a Grecian urn. Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. In early December 1816, under the heady influence of his artistic friends, Keats told Abbey he had decided to give up medicine in favour of poetry, to Abbey's fury. Keats had spent a great deal on his medical training, and despite his state of financial hardship and indebtedness, made large loans to friends such as the painter Benjamin Haydon. Keats would go on to lend £700 to his brother George. By lending so much, Keats could no longer cover the interests of his own debts. Having left his training at the hospital, suffering from a succession of colds, and unhappy with living damp rooms in London, Keats moved with his brothers into rooms at 1 Well Walk in the village of Hampstead in April 1817. There, John and George nursed their tubercular brother Tom. The house was close to Hunt and others of his circle in Hampstead, and to Coleridge, suspected elder of the first wave of romantic poets, then living in Highgate. On the 11th of April 1818, Keats reported that he and Coleridge had taken a long walk on Hampstead Heath. In a letter to his brother George, he wrote that they had talked about 1,000 things: nightingales, poetry, poetical sensation, metaphysics. Around this time he was introduced to Charles Wentworth Dilke and James Rice. In June 1818, Keats began a walking tour of Scotland, Ireland, and the Lake District with Charles Armitage Brown. Keats' brother George and his wife Georgina accompanied them to Lancaster and then continued to Liverpool, from where they migrated to America, living in Ohio and Louisville, Kentucky, until 1841, when George's investments failed. Like Keats' other brother, they both died penniless and racked by tuberculosis, for which there was no effective treatment until the next century. In July, while on the Isle of Mull, Keats caught a bad cold and was too thin and fevered to proceed on the journey. After returning south in August, Keats continued to nurse Tom, so exposing himself to infection. Some have suggested this was when tuberculosis, his family disease, took hold. Consumption was not identified as a disease with a single infectious origin until 1820. There was considerable stigma attached to it, and it was often tied with weakness, repressed sexual passion, or masturbation. Keats refused to give it a name in his letters. Tom Keats died on the 1st of December 1818. I note particularly where they're talking about the stigma attached to consumption. They don't give a reference. Interesting connotations they're suggesting anyway. Still, I won't read any further. I think that's more than enough on John Keats. Perhaps the most notable thing is that for some reason there is so much information about him on Wikipedia, whereas for a lot of these other poets, even some of the really very well-known ones, there isn't as much information. Still, so long story short, he came from a relatively poor background. He was given a series of opportunities in life, but decided to pursue poetry instead. He struggled financially for a lot of his life, and apparently his poetry wasn't well received until after his death. But after his death, his poetry became very, very influential. So, with that said, let's begin with first looking into Chapman's Homer. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. How's that pronounced? Sorry about this. Oh, it's pronounced domain. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then I felt like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. There appear to be quite a few places called Darien, so without some additional research... Oh! It says here, a peak in Darien, phrasing Keats' poem on first look into Chapman's Homer, referring to Darien province. Darien is a province in Panama, whose capital city is La Palma. we could research that some more, but it's probably not important. Just to know that they're referring to the conquest of South and Central America. Presumably Hernan Cortez, who was a Spanish conquistador who led an expedition that caused the fall of the Aztec Empire and brought large portions of what is now mainland Mexico under the rule of the King of Castile in the early 16th century. Cortez was part of the generation of Spanish explorers and conquistadors who began the first phase of the Spanish colonization of the Americas. So, I'll read it again. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then I felt like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken. Or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. There's clearly quite a lot of rhyming in this, but I'm struggling to see what the structure is here. So we have gold, which rhymes with hold and told, and bold, all further down. There's seen and been, which rhyme and are adjacent. And serene, further down. Domain, I don't think rhymes with anything. Nor does surmise. Darien with men and Ken. So yeah, this is interesting. There's clearly an effort to rhyme, and it works, but I can't spot a clear structure to it. So as far as rhythm is concerned, looks like there's 10 syllables per verse in most cases. Yes. Possibly all cases. I don't think there's a clear meter though, because just looking at the first verse, looking at the first verse, there isn't a clear meter that would fit. The most obvious ones being iambic or trochee don't work. What would that be called actually? Because then if it uses ions, it's iambic. So if it uses a trochee, is it trochaic? Yes. So for example, much have I travelled in the doesn't work. That would be iambic. As for trochaic, much have I travelled in the, again, doesn't work. So again, I'm not an expert on these things. I think we can dismiss a meter, but it clearly has a fixed number of syllables per verse, and there is rhyming, but the rhyming doesn't follow a clear pattern. Aside from it being end rhyme, it's at the end of each verse that words rhyme. Perhaps this is what they meant by exploring different poetic forms. Was that what they called it? Experimenting with verse forms. Perhaps that's what they meant. As for the meaning, it's quite clear. I would suggest that it's referring to, first of all, the power of the imagination and the fact that when you've seen places in your mind that are well described, it is as if you've been there, and then also describing the wonder and promise of being in a new rich land via the analogy with Cortez, I would suggest. So that covers rhyme, meter, or rhythm more generally, and the meaning of the poem. So I'll head on to the final reading of this particular poem. Again, if anyone has any questions, please put them into chat. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then I felt like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. Goodness me. The author of this anthology certainly seems keen on Keats' poetry, which I'm sure is a good thing. So the next poem is entitled An Ode to a Nightingale. So, I shall begin the first reading. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute passed, and leftwards had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beeching green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been called a long age in the deep-delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and provincial song and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim, and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. Fade far away, dissolve and quite forget, that thou amongst the leaves hast never known the weariness, the fever and the fret, here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs, where youth grows pale and the spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow, and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy. Few the dull brain perplexes and retards. Already with thee, tender as the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays, but here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown, through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet, wherewith this seasonable month endows, the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn, and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets, covered up in leaves, and mid-May eldest child, the coming musk rose full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. Darkling I listen, and for many a time I've been half in love with easeful death, call him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to seize upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still woundeth thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown, perhaps the selfsame song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth when, sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn, that same that oft times hath charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell, to tell me back from thee to my sole self. Adieu, the fancy cannot cheat so well, as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu, thy plaintive anthem fades, past the near meadows, over the still stream, upon the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision, or a waking dream? Fled is that music, do I wake or sleep? Goodness me. Seems like there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to be honest and say that I don't think I followed all of that. So I'm going to do something which we've only done a few times before. And I was going to suggest we read through the Wikipedia page for this poem, but it's actually really quite long, so perhaps it would be best to only read some of it. Ode to a Nightingale is a poem by John Keats, written either in the garden of the Spaniards Inn, Hampstead, London, or according to Keats' friend Charles Armitage Brown, under a plum tree in the garden of Keats' house at Wentworth Place, also in Hampstead. According to Brown, a nightingale had built its nest near the house that he shared with Keats in the spring of 1819. Inspired by the bird's song, Keats composed a poem in one day. It soon became one of his 1819 odes that was first published in the Annals of the Fine Arts the following July. The poem is one of the most frequently anthologized in the English language. Ode to a Nightingale is a personal poem which describes Keats' journey into the state of negative capability. Negative capability is a phrase first used by Romantic poet John Keats in 1817 to explain the capacity of the greatest writers to pursue a vision of artistic beauty even when it leads them into intellectual confusion and uncertainty, as opposed to a preference for philosophical certainty. The tone of the poem rejects the optimistic pursuit of pleasure found within Keats' earlier poems and instead explores the themes of nature, transience, and mortality, the latter being particularly relevant to Keats. The nightingale described experiences a type of death, but does not actually die. Instead, the songbird is capable of living through its song, which is a fate that humans cannot expect. The poem ends with an acceptance that pleasure cannot last and that death is an inevitable part of life. In the poem, Keats imagines the loss of the physical world and sees himself dead as a sod over which a nightingale sings. The contrast between the immortal nightingale and the mortal man sitting in his garden is made all the more acute by the effort of the imagination. The presence of weather is noticeable in the poem, as spring came early in 1819, bringing nightingales all over the heath. Structure. Ode to a Nightingale was probably the first of the middle set of 4 odes that Keats wrote following Ode to Psyche. According to Brown, this is further evidenced by the poem's structures. Keats experimentally combined 2 different types of lyrical poetry, the ode hymn and the lyric of questioning voice that responds to the odal hymn. The combination of structures is similar to that in Ode in a Grecian Urn. In both poems, the dual form creates a dramatic element within the text. The stanza form of the poem is a combination of elements from Petrarchan sonnets and Shakespearean sonnets. Keats incorporates a pattern of alternating historically short and long vowel sounds in his ode. In particular, line 18 and Purple Stained Mouth has the historical pattern of short followed by long, followed by short, and followed by long. This alternation is continued in longer lines, including line 31, Away, away, for I will fly to thee, which contains 5 pairs of alternations. However, other lines, such as line 3, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains, rely on a pattern of 5 short vowels followed by long and short vowel pairings until they end with a long vowel. These are not the only combination patterns present, and there are patterns of 2 short vowels followed by a long vowel in other lines, including 12, 22, and 59, which are repeated twice and then followed up with 2 different sets of short and then long vowel pairs. The reliance on the vowel sounds is not unique to this ode, but is common to Keats' other 1819 odes and his Eve of St. Agnes. The poem incorporates a complex reliance on assonance. The repetition of vowel sounds in a conscious pattern is found in many of his poems. Such a reliance on assonance is found in very few English poems. Within Ode to a Nightingale, an example of this pattern can be found in line 35, Already with thee, tender as the night, where the EA of already connects with the E of tender and the I of with connects with the I of is. The same pattern is found again in line 41, I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, with the A of cannot linking with the A of at, and the E of C linking with the E of feet. The system of assonance can be found in approximately 1/10 of the lines of Keats' later poetry. When it comes to the other sound patterns, Keats relies on double or triple caesaras in approximately 6% of lines throughout the 1819 odes. An example from Ode to a Nightingale can be found within line 45, the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, as the pauses after the commas are a masculine pause. Furthermore, Keats began to reduce the amount of Latin-based words and syntax that he relied on in his poetry, which in turn shortened the length of the words that dominate the poem. There is also an emphasis on words beginning with consonants, especially those that begin with B, P, or V. The first stanza relies heavily on these 3 consonants, and they're used as syzygy to add a musical tone within the poem. In poetry, a syzygy is a combination of 2 metrical feet into a single unit, similar to an elision. That would need more researching, I think. Compared to his earlier verse, spondees are relatively abundant in his 1819 odes and other late poems. In Ode to a Nightingale, they are used in just over 8% of his lines, compared to a mere 2.6% in Endymion. Examples include called a long age in the deep delved earth, where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs. To Walter Jackson Bate, the use of spondies in 31 to 34 creates a feeling of slow flight, and in the final stanza, the distinctive use of scattered spondies, together with initial inversion, lends an approximate phonetic suggestion of the peculiar spring and bounce of the bird in its flight. Well, my overall conclusion from all that is that there's a lot going on here that I don't understand, but that clearly a lot of attention was being paid to the sound of the poem, which I suppose isn't surprising since it is poetry, it is lyric in nature. That's what sets it apart from prose. I don't think I'm even going to attempt to do a proper analysis of this poem right now, because I don't think I'm up to the job. So instead, I will move on to a final reading of this poem. If anyone... Jenny says, I had a quick check about this poem and his works. Oh, this poet and his works. It looks like these works are records of his travellings. Maybe try to be straightforward when you don't understand things. Well, yes, I don't fully follow all of this, so as I was going to suggest, I will move on to the final reading of this poem. If anyone has any questions, please put them to chat and I will look at them shortly. And once I have finished the final reading and addressed any questions, we will then move on to Pride and Prejudice. So just to remind us, Ode to a Nightingale is a personal poem which describes Keats' journey into the state of negative capability. The tone of the poem rejects the optimistic pursuit of pleasure found within Keats' earlier poems and instead explores the themes of nature, transience and mortality, the later being particularly relevant to Keats. The Nightingale described experiences a type of death but does not actually die. Instead, the songbird is capable of living through its song, which is a fate that humans cannot expect. The poem ends with an acceptance that pleasure cannot last and that death is an inevitable part of life. In the poem, Keats imagines the loss of the physical world and sees himself dead as a sod, that being the top level of soil, over which the nightingale sings. The contrast between the immortal nightingale and the mortal man sitting in his garden is made all the more acute by an effort of the imagination. So, that's the relevant context, which will hopefully help this poem make a lot more sense. So, the final reading. My heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute passed, and leftwards had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. O for a draught of vintage that hath been called a long age in the deep-delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and provincial song and sunburnt mirth. O for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim, and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim, fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou among the leaves have never known, the weariness, the fever, and the fret, here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow, and laden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes on new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his bards, but on the viewless wings of poesy, through the dull brain perplexes and retards. Already with thee, tender as the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays, but here there is no light, save that from heaven is with the breezes blown, through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet, wherewith the seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May eldest child, the coming must rose, full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy, still wouldest thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird, no hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown, perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth when, sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn, the same that oftentimes hath charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas and fairy lands forlorn. Forlorn! The very word is like a bell, to tell me back from thee to my soul's self. Adieu, the fancy cannot cheat so well, and she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu, thy plaintive anthem fades, past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision, or a waking dream? Fled is that music, do I wake or sleep? So that was Ode to a Nightingale. So, if we move on, my apologies, if we move on to Pride and Prejudice, I will begin, as usual, by reviewing the chapters we read last week, and then we will begin on on some new chapters. So in chapter 34, Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth. She declines him, citing both his treatment of Mr. Bingley and her sister Jane, and of Mr. Wickham. So in particular, Elizabeth is under the impression that Mr. Darcy separated Elizabeth's sister Jane from Mr. Bingley, and she could only imagine that was due to him being prideful and Jane having more humble origins than would be to Mr. Darcy's tastes or Mr. Bingley's station. Although, as I recall, I think a lot of it was actually to do with not Jane herself, but rather her family. That's what Elizabeth imagined his reasonings to be. And Mr. Wickham, who Elizabeth understands was due to inherit a position in the church, something that was bequeathed to him by Mr. Darcy's late father, but Mr. Darcy apparently denied that. And so, as a result, Elizabeth considers Mr. Darcy to be quite a mean-spirited individual, one who has caused quite a lot of harm, and therefore declines his offer of marriage. In chapter 35, Mr. Darcy gives Jane a letter. In it, he explains both his reasons for detaching Mr. Bingley from Jane, chiefly because he thought Jane not to have expressed mutual feelings of love. So in other words, he knew that Mr. Bingley loved Jane, but wasn't convinced Jane loved Mr. Bingley. And he also explains the history of his dealings with Mr. Wickham, which paints Mr. Wickham in a rather unflattering way. Specifically, he suggests that Mr. Wickham asked, rather than going into the church, like the will had specified, that he'd like to go into law, but the amount of money necessary to get someone into the legal profession was considerably more than had been bequeathed to him in the will. Specifically, he was to be given the equivalent of £1,000 in the will, but to realistically get him into the legal profession would cost £3,000. Mr. Darcy claims that he accepted this and agreed to give him more money than he was owed, to which Mr. Wickham then squandered the money and then came back asking to go into the church instead, but receiving that money as well, because he had already had the £3,000 that he'd squandered, and Mr. Darcy said no to that. This was all explained in Mr. Darcy's letter to Elizabeth. In chapter 36, Jane initially rejects the arguments set out in the letter, but upon more sober reflection comes to the conclusion that the contents of the letter are probably honest, and that this being the case, Mr. Darcy's reasoning in the letter was fair. Based on what Mr. Darcy knew at the time, he was probably being reasonable. She does think that Jane had a problem with not expressing her emotions clearly, and that may have confidently misled Mr. Darcy. And in particular, she notes that Mr. Wickham's behaviour since she had known him could be interpreted in a rather more ignoble light than she had previously ascribed, and this would be consistent with the contents of Mr. Darcy's letter. So things like Mr. Wickham claiming that he doesn't have a problem with Mr. Darcy and so isn't afraid to be around him, but Mr. Darcy may wish to avoid him, and then it's Mr. Wickham that avoids going to the ball that he was invited to avoid contact, so that seems like a contradiction. Or the fact that Mr. Wickham said nothing about the way he had been ill-used to anyone but Elizabeth until Mr. Darcy left the area. Then he told everyone, which could be seen as being a little bit false, bringing someone into disrepute only when they aren't around to defend themselves. So although she can't comment on whether the story about Mr. Wickham being promised this inheritance which he then negotiated into a larger inheritance, squandered and then asked for again, she can't confirm or deny because she wasn't there. She's now thinking that, okay, perhaps this Mr. Wickham isn't such a nice chap and everything that Mr. Darcy said may well in fact be true. These were, of course, her reasons for rejecting Mr. Darcy. So that's where we're up to. So, chapter 37. The two gentlemen left Rosings, the two gentlemen being Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam, who I believe is Mr. Darcy's cousin. The two gentlemen left Rosings the next morning, and Mr. Collins, having been in the waiting near the lodges to make them his parting obeisance, was able to bring home the pleasing intelligence of their appearing in very good health and in tolerable spirits as could be expected after the melancholy scene so lately gone through at Rosings. To Rosings he had then hastened to console Lady Catherine and her daughter, and on his return brought back with great satisfaction a message from her ladyship, importing that she felt herself so dull as to make her very desirous of having them all to dine with her. It's funny, I've forgotten what terrible event happened at Rosings. Unless they're referring to Elizabeth rejecting Mr. Darcy, but I would be surprised if that was it. I would imagine they kept that private. Elizabeth could not see Lady Catherine without recollecting that, had she chosen it, she might by this time have been presented to her as her future niece, nor could she think, without a smile, of what her ladyship's indignation would have been. What would she have said? How would she have behaved? Were questions with which she amused herself. Their first subject was the diminution of the Rosings party. I assure you I feel it exceedingly, said Lady Catherine. I believe no one feels the loss of friends so much as I do, but I am particularly attached to those young men. I know them to be so much attached to me. They are excessively sorry to go, but so they always are. The dear Colonel rallied his spirits tolerably till just at last, but Darcy seemed to feel it most acutely, more I think than last year. His attachment to Rosings certainly increases. Mr. Collins had a compliment and an allusion to throw in here, which were kindly smiled on by the mother and daughter. Lady Catherine observed, after dinner, that Miss Bennet seemed out of spirits, and immediately accounted for it herself by supposing that she did not like to go home again so soon. She added, "But if that is the case, you must write to your mother and beg that you may stay a little longer. Mrs. Collins will be very glad of your company, I am sure." "I am much obliged to your ladyship for your kind invitation," replied Elizabeth, "but it is not in my power to accept it. I must be in town next Saturday." "Why, at that rate, you will have been here only 6 weeks. I expect you to stay 2 months. I told Mrs. Collins so before you came. There can be no occasion for your going so soon, There can be no occasion for you going so soon. Mrs. Bennet could certainly spare you for another fortnight, but my father cannot. He wrote last week to hurry my return." "Oh, your father of course may spare you, if your mother can. Daughters are never of so much consequence to a father, and if you will stay another month complete, it will be in my power to take one of you as far as London, for I am going there early in June, for a week, and as Dawson does not object to the barouche box, there will be a very good room for one of you, and indeed, if the weather should happen to be cool, I should not object to taking you both, as you are neither of you large." "You are all kindness, madam, but I believe we must abide by our original plan." Lady Catherine seemed resigned. Sorry, let me continue. Lady Catherine seemed resigned. "Mrs. Collins, you must send a servant with them. You know I always speak my mind, and I cannot bear the idea of 2 young women travelling post by themselves. It is highly improper. You must contrive to send somebody. I have the greatest dislike in the world to that sort of thing. Young women should always be properly guarded and attended, according to their situation in life. When my niece Georgina went to Ramsgate last summer, I made a point of having her 2 men servants go with her. Miss Darcy, the daughter of Mr. Darcy, a Pemberley, and Lady Anne could not have appeared with propriety. Sorry, I seem to be having some difficulty reading. Could not have appeared with propriety in a different manner. I am excessively attentive to all those things. You must send John with the young ladies, Mrs. Collins. I am glad it occurred to me to mention it, for it would really be discreditable to you to let them go alone. My uncle's to send a servant for us. Oh, your uncle! He keeps a manservant, does he? I'm very glad you have somebody who thinks of these things. Where shall we change horses? Oh, Bromley, of course. If you mention my name at the bell, you will be attended to." Lady Catherine had many questions to ask respecting their journey, and as she did not answer them all herself, attention was necessary, which Elizabeth believed to be lucky for her, or with her mind so occupied she might have forgotten where she was. Reflection must be reserved for solitary hours. Whenever she was alone, she gave way to it as the greatest relief, and not a day went by without a solitary walk in which she might indulge in all the delight of unpleasant recollections. Mr. Darcy's letter she was in a fair way of soon knowing by heart. She studied every sentence, and her feelings towards its writer were at times widely different. When she remembered the style of his address, she was still full of indignation, but when she considered how unjustly she had condemned and upbraided him, her anger was turned against herself, and his disappointed feelings became the object of compassion. His attachment excited gratitude, his general character respect, but she could not approve him, nor could she for a moment repent her refusal, or feel the slightest inclination ever to see him again. In her own past behaviour there was a constant source of vexation and regret, and in the unhappy defects of her family, a subject of yet heavier chagrin. They were hopeless of remedy. Her father, contented with laughing at them, would never exert himself to restrain the wild giddiness of his younger daughters, and her mother, with manners so far from right herself, was entirely insensible of the evil. Elizabeth had frequently united with Jane in an endeavour to check the imprudence of Catherine and Lydia, but while they were supported by their mother's indulgence, what chance could there be of improvement? Catherine, weak-spirited, irritable, and completely under Lydia's guidance, had been always affronted by their advice, and Lydia, self-willed and careless, would scarcely give them a hearing. They were ignorant, idle, and vain. While there was an officer in Meryton who would flirt with him, and while Meryton was within a walk of Longbourn, they would be going there forever. Anxiety on Jane's behalf was another prevailing concern, and Mr. Darcy's explanation, by restoring Bingley to all her former good opinion, heightened the sense of what Jane had lost. His affection was proved to have been sincere, and his conduct cleared of all blame, unless any could attach to the implicitness of his confidence in his friend. How grievous then was the thought that, of a situation so desirable in every respect, so replete with advantage, so promising for happiness, Jane had been deprived by the folly and indecorum of her own family. When to these recollections was added the development of Wickham's character, it may be easily believed that the happy spirits which had seldom been depressed before were now so much affected as to make it almost impossible for her to appear tolerably cheerful. Their engagements at Rosings were as frequent during the last week of her stay as they had been at first. The very last evening was spent there, and her ladyship again inquired minutely into the particulars of their journey, gave them directions as to the best method of packing, and was so urgent on the necessity of placing gowns in the only right way, that Maria thought herself obliged on her return to undo all the work of the morning and pack her trunk afresh. When they parted, Lady Catherine, with great condescension, wished them a good journey, and invited them to come to Hunsford again next year, and Miss de Bourgh exerted herself so far as to curtsy and hold out her hand to both. Chapter 38. On Saturday morning, Elizabeth and Mr. Collins met for breakfast a few minutes before the others appeared, and he took the opportunity of paying the parting civilities which he deemed indispensably necessary. "I know not, Miss Elizabeth," said he, "whether Mrs. Collins has yet expressed a sense of your kindness in coming to us, but I am very certain you'll not leave the house without receiving her thanks for it. The favour of your company has been much felt, I assure you. You know how little there is to tempt anyone to our humble abode. Our plain manner of living, our small rooms and few domestics, and the little we see of the world, must make Hunsford extremely dull to a young lady like yourself, but I hope you will believe us grateful for the condescension, and that we have done everything in our power to prevent your spending your time unpleasantly." Elizabeth was eager with her thanks and assurances of happiness. She had spent 6 weeks with great enjoyment, and the pleasure of being with Charlotte, and the kind attention she had received, must make her feel the obliged. Mr. Collins was gratified, and with a more smiling solemnity replied, "It gives me great pleasure to hear that you have passed your time not disagreeably. We have certainly done our best, and most fortunately having it in our power to introduce you to very superior society, and from our connections with Rosings the frequent means of varying the humble home scene. I think we may flatter ourselves that your Hunsford visit cannot have been extremely irksome. Our situation with regard to Lady Catherine's family is indeed the sort of extraordinary advantage and blessing which few can boast. You see on what footing we are. You see how continually we are continually we are engaged there. In truth, I must acknowledge that, with all the disadvantages of this humble parsonage, I should not think anyone abiding in it an object of compassion, while they are sharers of our intimacy at Rosings. Words were insufficient for the elevation of his feelings. He was obliged to walk about the room, while Elizabeth tried to unite civility and truth in a few short sentences. You may, in fact, carry a very favourable report of us into Hertfordshire, my dear cousin. I flatter myself, at least, that you will be able to do so. Lady Catherine's great attentions to Mrs. Collins will have been a daily witness of, and altogether I trust it does not appear that your friend has drawn an unfortunate. But on this point it will be as well to be silent. Only let me assure you, my dear Miss Elizabeth, that I can from my heart most cordially wish you equal felicity in marriage. My dear Charlotte and I have but one mind and one way of thinking. There is in everything a most remarkable resemblance of character and ideas between us. We seem to have been designed for each other. Elizabeth could safely say that it was a great happiness where that was the case, and with equal sincerity could add that she firmly believed and rejoiced in his domestic comforts. She was not sorry, however, to have the recital of them interrupted by the lady from whom they sprang. Poor Charlotte! It was a melancholy to leave us to such society, but she had chosen it with her eyes open, and though evidently regretting that her visitors were to go, she did not seem to ask her for compassion. A home and a housekeeping, her parish and her poultry, and all their dependent concerns had not yet lost their charms. At length the chaise arrived, the trunks were fastened on, the parcels placed within, and it was pronounced to be ready. After an affectionate parting between the friends, Elizabeth was attended to the carriage by Mr. Collins, and as they walked down the garden he was commissioning her with his best respects to all her family, not forgetting his thanks for the kindness he had received at Longbourn in the winter, and his compliments to Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, though unknown. He had then handed her in, Maria followed, and the door was on the point of being closed when he suddenly reminded them, with some consternation, that they had hitherto forgotten to leave any message for the ladies at Rosings. But he added, "You will of course wish to have your humble respects delivered to them, with your grateful thanks for their kindness to you while you have been here." Elizabeth made no objection. The door was then allowed to be shut, and the carriage drove off. "Good gracious!" cried Maria after a few minutes' silence. "It seems but a day or two since we first came, and yet how many things have happened!" "A great many indeed," said her companion with a sigh. "We have dined 9 times at Rosings, besides drinking tea there twice. How much I shall have to tell," Elizabeth added privately, "and how much I shall have to conceal." Their journey was performed without much conversation or any alarm, and within 4 hours of their leaving Hunsford they reached Mr. Gardiner's house, where they were to remain a few days. Jane looked well, and Elizabeth had little opportunity of studying her spirits, amidst the various engagements which the kindness of her aunts had reserved for them. But Jane was to go home with her, and at Longbourn there would be leisure enough for observation. It was not without an effort, meanwhile, that she could wait even for Longbourn, before she told her sister of Mr. Darcy's proposal. To know that she had the power of revealing that would so exceedingly astonish Jane, and must at the same time so highly gratify whatever of her own vanity she had not yet been able to reason away, was such a temptation to openness as nothing could have conquered but the state of indecision in which she remained as to the extent of what she should communicate, and a fear, if she once entered on the subject, of being hurried into repeating something of Bingley which might only grieve her sister further. Chapter 39. It was the second week in May in which the 3 young ladies set out together from Gracechurch Street for the town of in Hertfordshire, and as they drew near the appointed inn where Mr. Bennet's carriage was to meet them, they quickly perceived, in token of the coachman's punctuality, both Kitty and Lydia looking out of a dining-room upstairs. These two girls had been above an hour in the place, happily employed in visiting an opposite milliner, watching the sentinel on guard, and dressing a salad and cucumber. After welcoming their sisters, they triumphantly displayed a table set out with such cold meat as an inn larder usually affords, exclaiming, "Is not this nice? Is not this an agreeable surprise? And we mean to treat you all," added Lydia, "but you must lend us some money, for we have just spent hours at the shop out there." Then showing her purchases, "Look here, I've brought this bonnet. I do not think it very pretty, but thought I might as well buy it as not. I shall pull it to pieces as soon as I get home, and see if I can make it any better." And when her sisters abused it as ugly, she added with perfect unconcern, "Oh, but there were 2 or 3 much uglier in the shop, and when I have brought some prettier coloured satin to trim it with fresh, I think it will be very tolerable. Besides, it will not much signify what one wears this summer, after the Shire have left Meryton, and they are going in a fortnight." "Are they indeed?" cried Elizabeth with great satisfaction. "They are going to be encamped near Brighton, and I do not want Papa to take us all there for the summer." "Oh, and I do so want Papa to take us all there for the summer." This would be the soldiers that are leaving, incidentally. "It would be such a delicious scheme, and I dare say would hardly cost anything at all. Mamma would like to go too, of all things. Only think what a miserable summer else we shall have." Yes, thought Elizabeth, that would be a delightful scheme indeed, and completely do for us at once. Good heaven, Brighton and a whole campful of soldiers to us, who have been overset already by one poor regiment of militia and the monthly balls of Meryton. "Now I've got some news for you," said Lydia as they sat down at a table. "What do you think? It's excellent news, capital news, and about a certain person we all like." Jane and Elizabeth looked at each other, and the waiter was told he need not stay. Lydia laughed and said, "Aye, that is just like your formality and discretion. You thought the waiter must not hear, as if he cared. I dare say he often hears worse things said than I am going to say, but he's an ugly fellow, and I'm glad he is gone. I never saw such a long chin in my life. Well, but now for my news. It is about dear Wickham. Too good for the waiter, is it not? There is no danger of Wickham marrying Mary King. There's for you. She's gone down to her uncle at Liverpool, gone to stay. Wickham is safe." "And Mary King is safe," added Elizabeth, "safe from a connection imprudent as to fortune. She is a great fool for going away if she liked him. But I hope there is no strong attachment on either side," said Jane. "I'm sure there is not on his. I will answer for it. He never cared 3 straws about her. Who could about such a nasty little freckled thing?" Elizabeth was shocked to think that, however incapable of such coarseness of expression herself, the coarseness of the sentiment was little other than her own breast had harboured and fancied liberal. As soon as all had ate, and the elder ones paid, the carriage was ordered, and after some contrivance the whole party, with all their boxes, work bags and parcels, and the unwelcome addition of Kitty and Lydia's purchases, were seated in it. "How nicely we all crammed in," cried Lydia. "I'm glad I bought my bonnet, if it is only for the fun of having another band box. Well, now let us be quite comfortable and snug, and talk and laugh all the way home, and in the first place let us hear what has happened to you all since you went away. Have you seen any pleasant men? Have you had any flirting? I was in great hopes that one of you would have got a husband before you came back. Jane will be quite an old maid soon, I declare. She is almost 23. Lord, how ashamed I should be of not being married before 23. My Aunt Phillips wants you to go to get husbands. She can't think. She says Lizzie had better have taken Mr. Collins, but I do not think there would have been any fun in it. Lord, how I should like to be married before any of you, and then I would chaperone you about to all the balls. Dear me, we had such a good piece of fun the other day at Colonel Forster's. Kitty and me were to spend the day there, and Mrs. Forster promised to have a little dance in the evening. By the by, Mrs. Forster and me are such friends, so she asked the 2 Harringtons to come." But Harriet was ill, and so Pen was forced to come by herself. And then, what do you think we did? We dressed up Chamberlain in women's clothes on purpose to pass for a lady. Only think what fun. Not a soul knew of it, but Colonel and Mrs. Forster, and Kitty and me, except my aunt, for we were forced to borrow one of her gowns, and you can't imagine how well he looked. When Denny and Wickham and Pratt and 2 or 3 more of the men came in, they did not know him in the least. Lord, how I laughed. So did Mrs. Forrester. I thought I should have died, and that made the men suspect something. And then they soon found out what was the matter. Interesting. So I wonder who Chamberlain is. With such kinds of histories of their parties and good jokes, did Lydia, assisted by Kitty's hints and additions, endeavour to amuse her companions all the way to Longbourn. Elizabeth listened as little as she could, but there was no escaping the frequent mention of Wickham's name. Their reception at home was most kind. Mrs. Bennet rejoiced to see Jane in undiminished beauty. More than once during dinner did Mr. Bennet say voluntarily to Elizabeth, "I'm glad you are come back, Lizzie." Their party in the dining room was large, for almost all the Lucases came to meet Maria and hear the news, and various were the subjects that accompanied them. Lady Lucas was inquiring of Maria after the welfare and poultry of her eldest daughter. Mrs. Bennet was doubly engaged, on one hand collecting an account of the present fashions from Jane, who sat some way below her, and on the other retailing them all to the younger Lucases, and Lydia, in a voice rather louder than any other person's, was enumerating the various pleasures of the morning to anybody who would hear her. "Oh, Mary," said she, "I wish you had gone with us, for we had such fun. As we went along, Kitty and I drew up the blinds and pretended there was nobody in the coach, and I should have gone so all the way, if Kitty had not been sick. And when we got to the George, I do think we behaved very handsomely, for we treated the other 3 with the nicest cold luncheon in the world, and if you would have gone, we would have treated you too. And then when we came away, it was such fun. I thought we never should have all got into the coach. I was ready to die of laughter. And then we were so merry all the way home. We talked and laughed so loud that anybody might have heard us 10 miles off." To this Mary very gravely replied, "Far be it from me, my dear sister, to depreciate such pleasures. They will doubtless be congenial with the generality of female minds, but I confess they would have no charms for me. I should infinitely prefer a book." But of this answer Lydia heard not a word. She seldom listened to anybody for more than half a minute, and never attended to Mary at all. In the afternoon Lydia was urgent with the rest of the girls to walk to Meryton, to see how everybody went on, but Elizabeth steadily opposed the scheme. It should not be said that the Miss Bennets could not be at home half a day before they were in pursuit of officers. There was another reason too for her opposition. She dreaded seeing Mr. Wickham again, and resolved to avoid it as long as possible. The comfort to her of the regiment's approaching removal was indeed beyond expression. In a fortnight they were to go, and once gone, she hoped there could be nothing more to plague her on his account. She had not been many hours at home before she found that the Brighton scheme, of which Lydia had given them a hint at the inn, was under frequent discussion between her parents. Elizabeth saw directly that her father had not the smallest intention of yielding, but his answers were at the same time so vague and equivocal that her mother, though often disheartened, had never yet despaired of succeeding at last. Chapter 40. Elizabeth's impatience to acquaint Jane with what had happened could no longer be overcome, and at length resolving to suppress every particular in which her sister was concerned, and preparing her to be surprised, she related to her the next morning the chief of the scene between Mr. Darcy and herself. Miss Bennet's astonishment was soon lessened by the strong sisterly partiality which made an admiration of Elizabeth appear perfectly natural, and all surprise was shortly lost in other feelings. She was sorry that Mr. Darcy would have delivered his sentiments in a manner so little suited to recommend them, but still more while she grieved for the unhappiness which her sister's refusal must have given him. His being so sure of succeeding was wrong, said she, and certainly ought not to have appeared, but I consider how much it must increase his disappointment. Indeed, replied Elizabeth, I am heartily sorry for him, but he has other feelings which will probably soon drive away his regard for me. You do not blame me, however, for refusing him? Blame you? Oh, no. But you blame me for having spoken so warmly of Wickham. No, I do not know what you were wrong in. I do not know that you were wrong in saying what you did. But you will know it when I tell you what happened the very next day. She then spoke of the letter, repeating the whole of its contents as far as they concerned George Wickham. What a stroke was this for poor Jane, who would willingly have gone through the world without believing that so much wickedness existed in the whole race of mankind, as was here, collected in one individual. Nor was Darcy's vindication, though grateful to her feelings, capable of consoling her for such discovery. Most earnestly did she labour to prove the probability of error, and seek to clear one without involving the other. This will not do, said Elizabeth. You will never be able to make both of them good for anything. Take your choice, but you must be satisfied with only one. There is but such a quantity of merit between them, just enough to make one good sort of man, and of it late has been shifting about pretty much. For my part, I am inclined to believe it all Darcy's, but you shall do as you choose. It was some time, however, before a smile could be extorted from Jane. I do not know when I have been more shocked, said she. Wickham's so very bad, it is almost past belief, and poor Mr. Darcy, dear Lizzie, only consider what he must have suffered, such disappointment, and with the knowledge of your ill opinion too, and having to relate such a thing of his sister. It is really too distressing. I am sure you must feel it so. Oh, no, my regret and compassion are all done away by seeing you so full of both. I know you will do him such ample justice, that I am growing every moment more unconcerned and indifferent. Your profusion makes me saving. And if you lament over him much longer, my heart will be as light as a feather. Poor Wickham! There is such an expression of goodness in his countenance, such an openness and gentleness in his manner. There certainly was some great mismanagement in the education of those two young men. One has got all the goodness and the other all the appearance of it. I never thought Mr. Darcy so deficient in the appearance of it as you used to. I never thought Mr. Darcy so deficient in the appearance of it as you used to do. And yet I meant to be uncommonly clever in taking so decided a dislike of it to him, without any reason. It is such a spur to one's genius, such an opening for wit, to have a dislike of that kind. One may be continually abusive without saying anything, but one cannot always be laughing at a man without now and then stumbling on something witty. Lizzie, when you first read that letter, I am sure you could not treat the matter as you do now. Indeed, I could not. I was uncomfortable enough, I may say unhappy, and with no one to speak to about what I felt, no Jane to comfort me and say that I had not been so very weak and vain and nonsensical as I knew I had. Oh, how I wanted you! How unfortunate that you should have used such a very strong expression in speaking of Wickham to Mr. Darcy, for now they do appear wholly undeserved. Certainly, but the misfortune of speaking with bitterness is a most natural consequence of the prejudices I had been encouraging. There is one point on which I want your advice. I want to be told whether I ought or ought not to make our acquaintance in general understand Wickham's character. Make our acquaintances in general understand Wickham's character. Miss Bennet paused a little and then replied, surely there can be no occasion for exposing him so dreadfully. What is your opinion? They ought not to be attempted. Mr. Darcy has not authorised me to make his communication public. On the contrary, every particular relative sister was meant to be kept as much as possible to myself, and if I endeavour to undeceive people as to the rest of his conduct, who will believe me? The general prejudice against Mr. Darcy is so violent that it would be the death of half the good people in Meryton to attempt to place him in an amiable light. I am not equal to it. Wickham will soon be gone, and therefore it will not signify to anyone here what he really is. Some time hence it will be all found out. and then we may laugh at their stupidity in not knowing it before. At present I will say nothing about it. You are quite right. To have his errors made public might ruin him forever. He is now perhaps sorry for what he has done and anxious to re-establish a character. We must not make him desperate. The tumult of Elizabeth's mind was allayed by this conversation. She had got rid of two of the secrets which had weighed on her for a fortnight, and was certain of a willing listener in Jane whenever she might wish to talk again of either. But there was still something lurking behind, of which prudence forbade the disclosure. She dared not relate the other half of Mr. Darcy's letter, nor explain to her sister how sincerely she had been valued by her friend. Here was knowledge in which no one could partake, and she was sensible that nothing less than a perfect understanding between the parties could justify her in throwing off this last encumbrance of mystery. And then, said she, if that very improbable event should ever take place, I shall merely be able to tell what Bingley may tell in a much more agreeable manner himself. The liberty of communication cannot be mine till it has lost all its value. She was now on being settled at home, at leisure to observe the real state of her sister's spirits. Jane was not happy. She still cherished a very tender affection for Bingley. Having never even fancied herself in love before, her regard had all the warmth of first attachment, and, from her age and disposition, greater steadiness than most first attachments often boast, and so fervently did she value his remembrance, and prefer him to every other man, that all her good sense, all her attention to the feelings of her friends, were requisite to check the indulgence of those regrets which must have been injurious to her own health and their tranquillity. "Well, Lizzie," said Mrs. Bennet one day, "what is your opinion now of this sad business of Jane's? For my part, I am determined never to speak of it again to anybody. I told my sister Phillips so the other day, but I cannot find out that Jane saw anything of him in London. Well, he's a very undeserving young man, and I do not suppose there's the least chance in the world of her ever getting him now. There is no talk of his coming to Netherfield again in the summer, and I've inquired of everybody too who is likely to know. I do not believe he will ever live at Netherfield any more. Oh well, it is as he chooses. Nobody wants him to come. I shall always say he used my daughter extremely ill, and if I was her, I would not have put up with it. Well, my comfort is, I'm sure Jane will die of a broken heart, and then he will be sorry for what he has done." But as Elizabeth could not receive comfort from any such expectation, she made no answer. "Well, Lizzie," continued her mother soon afterwards, "and so the Collinses live very comfortably, do they? Well, well, I only hope it will last. And what sort of table do they keep? Charlotte is an excellent manager, I dare say. If she is half as sharp as her mother, she is saving enough. There is nothing extravagant in their housekeeping, I dare say." "No, nothing at all. A great deal of good management, depend upon it. Yes, they will take care not to outrun their income. They will never be distressed for money. Well, much good may it do them. And so I suppose they often talk of having Longbourn when your father is dead. They look upon it as quite their own, I dare say, whenever that happens. It was a subject which they could not mention before me. No, it would have been strange if they had, but I make no doubt they often talk of it between themselves. Well, if they can be easy with an estate that is not lawfully their own, so much the better. I should be ashamed of having one that was so entailed on me." I think we'll stop the Pride and Prejudice there this week and move on to the riddles. So we finished last week on riddle 68, which is as follows. "With youth and beauty blessed, from distant lands I came, nor has the country been ashamed to let me bear her name. No lady yet could ever boast complexion half so fine, though now my colour's black as those that dig in the coal mine. When I was young and fair, a happy life was mine, by a fond mistress was caressed, and in her sweet did shine. But from the jilt as years advanced, as I grew thin and old, the usage that I then received you'll scarce believe when told, with iron pincers that should seized upon my tender frame, and forced me by consuming fire to change my form and name. Within a dungeon close and dark, unhappy I am thrown, with villains who have hearts as hard as iron or of stone. Nor can I ever hope that they will mercy to me show, when they do nothing else but give each other blow for blow. A hateful match, oh, then she did most cruelly provide a circumstance I much desired for ever to hide. Nor had I named it, but I know my fellow prisoners' spite is such that they would never rest till I was brought to light. I must confess I've forgotten the solution to this, but I remember it being something like Irish cloth and tinder or something like that. I distinctly recall that it was something that sorry. I distinctly remember it was something that I didn't recognise, and after having looked it up following the stream, I still couldn't find any reference to it. Irish cloth and tinder. So the only thing that I can imagine is that there's some sort of cloth that has a specific purpose that is used within a lady's suite, whatever that might be. If I had to guess, I wonder if that's where ensuite comes from, and it refers to a room where a lady would wash and or I'm trying to think of the word. Applying makeup, that sort of thing. But I could be absolutely wrong, that's just a guess. And that when that cloth gets worn out, that they then turn it into tinder for lighting fires. But that's my best guess. I could not find any reference to Irish cloth and tinder online. So, I don't know. Still, that's the one we left off on last week. So, 69. We are a score, nay something more, within a cave reside. Though we but seldom disagree, we very oft divide. If we fall out, it is a doubt, if ever we meet again. Both bow and bell our worth can tell, though oft we cause them pain. In white array the ladies gay, and sprightly often show us. From what is said we are afraid, you will too quickly know us. Score, of course, being 20. So where it says we are a score, nay something more, that presumably means there's more than 20 of them. Could be gems, possibly, but I don't know why it would specifically say that there's more than 20 of them. We are a score, nay something more, within a cave reside. Though we but seldom disagree, we very often divide. If we fall out, it is a doubt if ever we meet again. Both bow and bell our worth can tell, though oft we cause them pain. In white array the ladies gay, and sprightingly often show us, from what is said we are afraid, you will too quickly know us. Jenny says 20-something within a cave. Something like a game. If there are 20 units in a game like chess. It's a good point that it may not be a physical cave, or rather it may not be a literal cave. But it's very notable. It says, if we fall out, it is a doubt if ever we meet again. Because if they were pieces in some game, then they would meet again all the time. My best guess is that it's gems of some sort, but I wouldn't be surprised if I'm wrong. This is 69. Teeth. We are a scorn, they something more within a cave reside. Though we but seldom disagree, we very often divide. If we fall out, it is a doubt if ever we meet again. Both bow and bell our worth can tell, though oft we cause them pain. Toothache. In white array the ladies gay, and sprightingly often show us, from what is said we are afraid you will too quickly know us. That's a good one. And I'm a bit disappointed that I didn't try harder and get that one. More than 20 white things in a cave. Teeth. So, 70. Come, seraphic 9, from Pindus, swift as fancy's flight descend. Dine blessed virgins to befriend us, and your melting numbers lend. In a plain renowned for beauty, as the fair Idalian grove, well we serve thee such our duty, little mighty god of love. Roses there with blushes glowing, in refulgent pride appear, there with fairest lustre blowing, lilies flourish through the year. Oft we melt with poignant anguish, sometimes glow with fury bright, now with tender passion languish, soon again express delight. Though by nature's laws appointed, in our narrow sphere to move, we with nature's works acquainted, visit Saturn, Mars, or Jove. Some will say, but don't believe them, we in magic often deal, doctors find we may deceive them, wound to where they cannot heal. Sylvia, now, if you'll discover what we are and make us known, in return we'll show your lover what you'd blush with shame to own. Goodness, that's a difficult one. Come, seraphic 9, from Pindus, swift as fancy's flight descend, dine blessed virgins to befriend us, and your melting numbers lend. In a plain renowned for beauty, as with fair Idalian grove, well we serve thee such our duty, little mighty god of love. Roses there with blushes glowing, in refulgent pride appear, There with fairest lustre blowing, lilies flourish through the year. Oft we melt with poignant anguish, sometimes glow with fury bright. Now with tender passion languish, soon again express delight. Though by nature's laws appointed, in our narrow sphere to move, we with nature's works acquainted, visit Saturn, Mars, or Jove. Some will say, but don't believe them, we in magic often deal. Doctors find we may deceive them, wound to where we cannot heal. Wound to where they cannot heal. Sylvia, now if you'll discover what we are and make us known, in return we'll show your lover what you'd blush with shame to own. There's a lot of references here that I'm not getting. Can't figure out what the reference to Sylvia is. Where's Pindus? Or what is Pindus? Pindus is a mountain range located in northern Greece and southern Albania. It is roughly 160 kilometers long with a maximum... Okay, but what is its significance? To mythology, if any. I really don't know. The only thing I can think that maybe it might be is, could there be a group of in Greek mythology, could there be a group of deities associated with the emotions or the moods? Like you have the Furies, specifically to do with anger. Could there be more generally a group of deities that deal with emotions? Come, seraphic 9 from Pindus, swift as fancy's flight descend. From Pindus, maybe? Dying blessed virgins to befriend us and lend your melting numbers. And your melting numbers lend. In a plain renowned for beauty as the fair Idalian grove, will we serve thee, such our duty, little mighty god of love. Roses there with blushes glowing, in refulgent pride appear, there with fairest lustre blowing, lilies flourish through the year. Oft we melt with poignant anguish, sometimes glow with fury bright. Now with tender passion languish, soon again express delight. See, these, taken literally, it would be very odd for something to be able to melt and glow, but could this be a reference to emotions? Though by nature's laws appointed, in our narrow sphere to move, we with nature's work acquainted visit Saturn, Mars, or Jove. Some will say, but don't believe them, we in magic often deal. Doctors find we may deceive them, wound to where they cannot heal. Sylvia, now if you'll discover what we are and make us known, in return we'll show your lover what you'd blush with shame to own. I'm gonna look this one up, not least because I really don't think I'm gonna get it. Eyes. Comes seraphic 9 from Pindar, swift as fancy's flight descend, dying blessed virgins to befriend us and your melting numbers lend. In plain renowned for beauty, as the fair Idalian grove, well we serve thee, such our duty, little mighty God of love. Roses there with blushes glowing, in refulgent pride appear, there with fairest lustre blowing, lilies flourish through the year. Oft we melt with poignant anguish, sometimes glow with fury bright. Ah, that's true. Eyes being described as glowing when one is furious. And you might describe someone's eyes as melting, in a metaphorical sense. Now with tender passion languish, soon again express delight. Though by nature's laws appointed, in our narrow sphere to move, oft we with nature's works acquainted, visit Saturn, Mars, or Jove. Some will say, but don't believe them, we in magic often deal, doctors find we may deceive them, wound to where they cannot heal. Sylvia, now if you'll discover what we are and make us known, in return we'll show your lover what you'd blush with shame to own. I don't follow all of this, especially the last part I don't really get, but some of it I can see now in retrospect. Jenny says, what does the name Sylvia mean? I assume it's a mythological figure, but I couldn't place who. There's probably a Sylvia in Greek mythology, I would guess. The name originates from the Latin word for forest, silver, and its meaning is spirit of the wood. The mythological god of the forest was associated with the figure Sylvanus. No, I think there's references here that I'm just not getting. Alright, we'll try one more. Ladies, I pray, my name declare, for surely without me, you neither could be tall nor fair, nor could you clearly see. Graceful you never would be deemed, nor amiable nor smart, and though you might be much esteemed, you'd never gain a heart. To cards and dancing I'm a friend, of balls I'm often won, and though on vice I never attend, virtue I always shun. Jenny says, but what about dancing? What would you like to see when you dance? Well, I assume that whatever the answer to this riddle is something that would generally be an asset to a dancer. But it may not be a physical thing, it may be an attribute of a person, for example. Like one of the the answer to one of the previous riddles was wit. It's really throwing me though, the line about you neither could be tall nor fair nor could you clearly see. Because what one thing, if you didn't have it, would mean that you were neither tall nor you could clearly see? I mean, the very obvious answer would be something like a head. But then, why would a head shun virtue? So, that's not the solution. I wonder if it could be something like a partner. Lady, I pray, my name declare, for surely without me, you neither could be tall nor fair, nor could you clearly see. That doesn't quite work, but it's along the right line. See, I was thinking, really, being tall is a relative thing. If you're not being compared to someone else, then in what sense can you be tall? I suppose you could say that... I'm not sure what they're getting at by clearly see, but certainly being tall or fair, it kind of makes sense. If there's no one with you, no one to observe you, or to be compared with, how could you be tall or fair? Graceful you would never be deemed, not amiable nor smart. Of course you couldn't, because there's no one there to make those judgments. And though you might be much esteemed, you'd never gain a heart. Well, you could... I suppose you could... Yeah, the much esteemed one doesn't quite work, does it? Although you could argue that you could esteem yourself, sort of. But you'd never gain a heart. Of course not, because there is no one else. To cards and dancing, I'm a friend. Yes, you'd need a partner to dance or play cards. At balls, I'm often one. Yes, at a ball, you would have one partner. And though on vice I never attend, virtue I always shun. Again, you could argue that it's very hard to be virtuous if you're on your own. It doesn't quite work, but it's the best I can think of. Okay, I'm going to look this one up. This is 71, isn't it? Letter A. Oh, of course, the one thing we never do. We never check for a linguistic solution. At least I always forget. Ladies, I pray, my name declare, for surely without me you neither could be tall nor fair, nor could you clearly see. Graceful you would never be deemed, nor amiable nor smart, and though you might be much esteemed, you'd never gain a heart. To cards and dancing I'm a friend, at balls I'm often won, and though on vice I never attend, virtue I always shun. Yep. The letter A. I completely missed that. Completely forgot to check. Oh well. Have to try to remember next time. So, thank you for coming, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the stream. I won't be streaming on Friday, even though that would be a normal streaming time for me. I will probably be streaming on Saturday. As usual, that would be announced on Twitter just after I've gone live. Monday, it will be back to Grim Fandango. Next Wednesday, more poetry, prose and riddles. And the following Friday, I should be streaming as usual. Saturday's stream, if it does go ahead, will be more Pokemon Crystal. So, I hope everyone had hope everyone enjoyed the stream, and I wish you all a wonderful night.